lovely to see you all on such a glorious day. I do apologise, first of all, for the heat in this room. It must be quite unusual to have to apologise for the heat in Cumbria, I guess. Well, I know because I live here. But tonight's one of those nights. Welcome to this election husting for the new Westmorland and Lonsdale constituency. It's being organised by the Friends of the Lake District, an independent charity that campaigns to protect and enhance Cumbria's landscapes. My name's Kaz Graham. I live in this constituency along with my family in Kendal, and I work as a broadcast journalist. And you might have heard me over the last 20-odd years reporting on BBC Radio 4 on all kinds of issues and presenting programmes like Farming Today. And I am delighted to be sharing this hustings for you this evening. First of all, a few words about the format of the event, starting with which candidates are here. There are 8 prospective parliamentary candidates running for the seat of Westmorland and Furness, and those representing parties who currently have MPs sitting in Westminster were invited to take part this evening. Those who accepted that invitation will be introducing themselves shortly, so we can all look forward to that, and then answering your questions. And we've set aside a little time for debate between the candidates as well, although we will be finishing by 9:30, 10:15 at the latest, depending on how we all fare with the heat. So that's our kind of format for the evening. Now, as you know, Friends of the Lake District invited questions from everybody who registered to come along tonight, and there were a lot of them, good ones as well. They've whittled them down to a manageable number, covering a broad range of issues that are all pertinent to this specific hustings. And this hustings, as you know, is focusing on the environment and on landscape. If your question's been selected, you will have been told about it, and either Kate or Lorraine will be around with a roving mic so that you can ask your question in person. And then also let us know afterwards whether you're satisfied with the answers that you get. So you get 2 goes, as it were. The loos are at the back through the double doors, right behind the kind of foyer area there. Emergency exits, I'm sure we won't need them, but if we do, door there that you came in, or the door at the back that you came in. And we're going to begin tonight's proceedings with a few words from Mike Hill. And Mike is the Chief Executive Officer of Friends of the Lake District.
Hello, welcome to our hustings for the Cumbrian landscape. For those who haven't come across Friends of the Lake District before, we're a landscape charity. Landscape means different things to different people, but to us it means the special combination of nature and culture that makes this place unique. Flora, fauna, fungi, water, rocks, but also farms, walls, hedges, barns, houses, transport, tourism and communities. And we'll be touching on some of those areas tonight. Now, we've just published our manifesto for Cumbrian landscapes, and it represents Friends of the Lake District's demands on behalf of the landscape to the politicians seeking our votes. There's a copy on everyone's seat, so I'll leave you to look through it. But those are the kind of areas we'll be discussing tonight. And we want you to keep them in mind when you decide where to place your cross on July the 4th. To be clear, Friends of the Lake District has no political affiliation. We're completely open-minded in this. We just believe that landscape matters for our society, for our economy, for our creativity, and for our well-being. And if you're on Twitter tonight, or X as we must now call it, #LandscapeMatters is our tag, so please use that if you're tweeting. Now tonight we're obviously talking about our landscapes here in Cumbria, particularly the ones in this constituency, but there's a bigger national picture behind all this, and I'm proud to say that we're supported tonight by Campaign for National Parks, who have a much wider remit. Here's Nick from CNP, just to say a few words of welcome.
Hi all, I won't take up any more time because I know we really want to hear from the candidates. I'm Nick from Campaign for National Parks, and Mike very kindly invited me along, and it's a real pleasure to come along, and fantastic, well done for coming out here and putting questions to the candidates. CMP, yes, as Mike said, we're a national organisation that work very closely with Friends of the Lake District and organisations like them across the country. We're the only independent campaign group for national parks in England and Wales. And we started in the 30s. We played a seminal, vital role in the actual creation of the legislation that founded national parks, which celebrates its 75th anniversary this year in December, if you want to think about the winter already. But this year is the 75th anniversary, and we believe that the National Park and Access to the Countryside Act should be celebrated and treasured in the same way of the founding of the NHS and all that seminal legislation that was founded in the post-war government. We agree with everything that the Friends of the Lake District have published, and we've put forward our own 7-point manifesto, which, whether you know it or not, was emailed to candidates a few weeks ago. And we believe there's a real opportunity for whoever forms the next government and whoever ends up in Parliament in Westminster. The national parks are facing plenty of challenges. The legislation was created 75 years ago, and so it needs looking at again in very many ways so that national parks, just like the Lake District, can thrive for the next 75 years and into the 22nd century. Anyway, I'll hand over, but thanks very much for having me.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick. Okay, time now to get to know our Westmorland and Lonsdale candidates. First of all, who we are not joined by this evening. Matty Jackson, the Conservative candidate, was invited to take part tonight, but he had a prior engagement. You can read about it on the sheet of A4 that is on your seats. It's got a statement from Matty. He sent his apologies. Friends of the Lake District did ask his office and also the Conservative group on Westmorland and Furness Council to offer us a sub, but neither could send a representative this evening. James Townley is standing for Reform UK. Reform has one MP in the House of Commons, Lee Anderson, hence James Townley was invited tonight too. He was also unable to join us, and he sent a statement as well, which is on the same piece of A4 as the statement from Matty Jackson. The three other candidates for this seat who weren't invited to participate because they don't represent parties currently sitting in Westminster are Wendy Long for the Social Democratic Party, Izzy Solabarrieta for the Heritage Party, and John Studholme, who is running as an independent. So, who do we have this evening? Okay, well, I'm going to ask each candidate to introduce themselves and at the same time give us some thoughts on quite a broad question that was suggested by Graham Jarvis. I think Graham might well be in the audience. So, Graham, I hope you don't mind. We've purloined your question for this because we thought it'd be a really good one. We thought it would be a good way to get a bit of an insight into our candidates' ways of thinking. That question is, what future do you envisage for the Lake District and how do you propose to engineer it? So it's a bit about yourself and a few thoughts on, how you see the future of the Lake District and how we get there, I suppose. We're going to be starting with a different speaker every time and finishing with a different speaker every time, so no one has to go first all the time and no one goes last all the time, just so that you know. And I think what we'll do is, since you're sitting next to me, Pippa, let's start with you. And you've got 3 minutes, no more, okay?
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pippa Smith, and I'm standing for the Labour Party here in Westmorland and Lonsdale. Let me tell you a little bit about me. So I grew up in the South Lakes, so like many of you who also grew up here, I spent my childhood climbing fells and swimming in lakes, and now being back here as an adult, some of my favourite pastimes are swimming, paddleboarding, hiking, although my lake of choice these days is Coniston rather than Windermere, given some of the sewage problems that we've got in that lake. My day job is that I work in the charity sector. So I work with a number of organisations that are on the front line of the growing hardship that we're seeing in our communities across Cumbria. And to be quite honest, I'm angry, and that's why I've decided that I'm going to stand. It's not just the sewage that we've got in our rivers and our lakes, it's also the fact that you can't get a GP appointment when you need one. It's the fact that the threshold for mental health care is so high, the fact that you can't get a dentist appointment, the fact that our schools don't have the budget that they need to cover the essentials for their pupils, and particularly those with special educational needs. All of this together, I think, is showing us that our public services are at breaking point, and enough is enough. We can keep doing the same thing again and again. We've had 14 years of Conservative government now, so that's 14 years of austerity and chaos, particularly in the last few years. I think it's time for a change, which is why I put myself forward to stand for the Labour Party. If you vote Labour on the 4th of July, change is possible. We've got a fully costed, fully planned manifesto to turn Britain around and introduce a decade of national renewal. But if you want change, and if you don't want things to continue the way that they are, you have to vote Labour on the 4th of July. So don't keep doing the same thing. Vote Labour, vote for a government that can bring in change. Now, if I was bringing this back to the Lake District and what I want to see for the future of the Lake District, so this place, it means a lot to me because I grew up here, because I live here. The first thing I did when lockdown ended was I walked the Cumbria Way with my dad and really enjoyed spending that time back out in nature. And I think the first thing I'll do once this is all over is another long distance hike whenever I can find the time to do that. So that's what I do, that's what it means to me. Being out in nature is personal for me. And this is something that I really, really care about. This is my home, this is an area that means a lot to me. So what I want to see for a future for the Lake District is somewhere that you can have those moments where it feels wild, where you have those escapes to get away from it all. You have that opportunity to be a person interacting with nature. So what I would say is that I want to see a Lake District that works together with people and nature for a thriving, greener and cleaner Westmorland and Lonsdale.
Terrific. Thank you, Pippa. Phil.
Okay, right. Good evening. My name is Phil Clayton and I'm representing the Green Party. What I want to talk to you about this evening is a little bit about me, but mostly I want to talk about why I think it's critical that you vote Green on the 4th of July. So my background is I've lived in this area for 23 years. It's where I brought up my family, and therefore I understand what it's like to be reliant on third-rate public transport. You can't get a dentist, you can't get a GP's appointment, etc., etc., etc. So all of those things matter to me in the same way that they matter to you. In terms of my politics, I describe myself as a progressive. I've always been to the left of centre. Sadly, in this part of the world, that means I spent 18 years voting for him. And he's a lovely man, but I don't agree with his politics. The reason I've done that is because it's the only way to keep the Tories out. And I reflected recently on what that's got me, and what it's actually got me is 14 years of austerity and sleaze and corruption and incompetence on a truly breathtaking scale. So, I was reminded of the old joke, Pippa's just stolen my best line. Insanity is best described as doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. So let's stop that, shall we? So what I think we need to do is we need to, what I did was looked again at all the different parties, and I concluded, no offence to my colleagues here, they are the same. We've got blue Tories, we've got red Tories, we've got yellow Tories. Look at their policies on all the things that matter, whether it's climate change, the NHS, social care, they are the same. The differences are minuscule, and they all fudge the big issue. None of them say how they're going to pay for it. The Green Party is the only party that's saying taxes are going to rise, kids. They just are. No one else will tell you that. They will pretend they can do the impossible. So that's why I'm in politics. In terms of priorities, there's so much wrong with this country, it's difficult to pick out three, but I'll try. First thing, homes. We need to build affordable, insulated homes for local people. Second thing is jobs. We need to invest in renewable energy, not least to generate the kind of high-tech, high-skills, high-wage jobs that Cumbrians need. And finally, health. We need to invest some of the massive wealth of this country. We are a very wealthy country in the NHS and sort it out. Despite all the problems we've got, this is not a time for despair. It really isn't. This is a time for hope. This is a time for change. And I genuinely believe I'm the only progressive in the room, or at least the only progressive on this panel. So if you want change, vote for us. One final thought. Like me, you've probably been bombarded with the excellent publicity from the gentleman at my right, which says over and over again, you've got to vote for him to keep the Tories out. I'm here to tell you it's not quite true. The Tories are toast. They're toast nationally. They're toast in this constituency. Even with the boundary changes, Tim is 20 points ahead. Last week we did a different Hustings, I quoted 17 points. It's gone up. The gap is widening. He cannot lose. He knows it, I know it, and I think even Pippa knows it. So what that means for you guys is liberation. You don't have to vote for what you voted before. You can actually vote for your conscience.
And that's your 3 minutes, Phil.
Right.
I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tim Farron. I used to work at the university here. And 19 years ago, Mr. Blair went to the palace and called a general election. I had to down tools and only came back to my office to hand on. Just a quick reflection on some things that Phil said. A couple of things. It's absolutely fine to vote for somebody else, of course it is. But the notion that you'd only vote for me if you're voting against your conscience is a small insult. And the second thing to say is I spent earlier part of this day up in Threlkeld, which is part of the 20,000 voters that come into this constituency. You might remember that at the last general election, the 28% of the constituency that was Penrith and the Border had an 18,000 Conservative majority. Anybody who's genuinely progressive and also not arrogant does not assume the Tories have lost here. On paper, I'm at least 6,000 votes behind. But having said all that, I'm the person on the election on this panel, well, actually, maybe Phil probably agrees with me as well. Of the manifestos on offer, I am one of those offering an electoral system which would allow you to vote for these people without wasting your vote. And if you're in Lancaster or in Carlisle, to vote Lib Dem without wasting your vote. I think it's flipping awful we have an electoral system that makes people choose between two. It's a shocking system, but you therefore need to vote for somebody who's actively going to try and change the system once they get elected, which I have done time and time and time again in Parliament. If we do get a Labour majority government, maybe, just maybe, they'll understand that the only way the UK will have a decent government long term is if we change this rotten electoral system. So I am Tim Farron. I have served you as a Member of Parliament for the last 19 years. I take absolutely nothing for granted. And I care about the lakes and I care about the dales. It's worth bearing in mind this is a constituency with two national parks, the Yorkshire and Westmorland Dales, as we now call them, and of course here in the Lake District. What do I see about the future of the Lake District? Well, I'll say this. My first two political acts were joining Shelter when I was 14, because I watched Cathy come home and it made me cry, and joining Greenpeace when I was 15. And I knew of the existence of the Green Party back then, and my sense is simply this, and I say this gently, my sense is that every Liberal Democrat is a Green, and not every Green is a Liberal, and that's why I'm in the Liberal Democrats. And I take the view that it's really, really, really important that we value human beings every bit as much as we value the planet. Equally important, valuably, significantly important. And my worry about the Lake District is simply this. We are the most populated national park in the country. And yet one of the reasons there is a boundary change is because the population, the permanent population of Cumbria is shrinking. And it's particularly shrinking in communities like ours. So housing and the environment, those two things that triggered my political interest as a teenager, turn out to be the two key issues here in our communities. Because if we care about the future, the people that come next, we have to care about the planet we bequeath to them. And that means working alongside farmers and others who are custodians of our countryside, and indeed those who are responsible for our waterways, to make sure they are in a worthwhile condition to hand on to others. But we must also not be blind to the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen a slow bleed of our communities away from being lively, vibrant communities full of people to those where so many homes are not lived in, schools are at risk, and all the other things that fall as part of that.
And
so
Tim,
the future for the National Park...
You're over your 3 minutes now, and you're going to have lots of time to talk about all of these things.
There you go.
Lots of questions about
Ta-da.
all of those relevant
Thank you.
things. So, there we go. Okay, so we are now up and running, and we're going to start off with our questions from the floor. I should have said this earlier, and I know you all will have, but please put your mobile phones on airline or turn them off if you have not done that already. I know that you all have, so that's all right. Okay, now, if you are one of our audience members who are asking a question, please wait until the roving mic gets to you, because it just means that everybody can hear you, and that always is a big help. Candidates will have around 2.5 minutes to answer, and after we've heard from you all, there'll be about another 3, maybe 4 minutes, depending on how we're feeling and how we're doing for time and whether there's a fight or not for you to talk amongst yourselves or discuss amongst yourselves. And then we're going to come back to the questioner after that, just to hear what their response is. Are they happy with the answers they've got or not happy? Who knows, as the case may be. So we're going to come to our first questioner, and that is Matt Staniak, who many people will be familiar with because of the high-profile Save Windermere campaign. Matt, do you have a mic?
Yeah, I do.
Hooray!
I'm going to have to put a tiny bit of context before the question, but I can assure you that the question does come at the end. So,
Not too much context, please. We're after questions, not statements.
No, it's brief.
Okay.
So there are 3 main inputs of nutrient that we're told about when it comes to Windermere. It's agriculture, it's United Utilities, and it's septic tanks. We do not have the agricultural practice in this catchment that causes the decline of water quality. When we talk about that, we're talking about arable farming, intensive dairy, intensive poultry. Agriculture is just not the issue here. Septic tank owners cannot remove nutrient from their systems, and there's actually legislation in place that demonstrates that United Utilities can take ownership of these non-main drains if it's proven to show an ecological impact. And then there's, of course, United Utilities that we all know about. They have discharged up to 27,700 hours worth of untreated sewage in the since 2020. They've broken the law. They're allowed to discharge up to 13 million litres a day in treated sewage, which is having as much of an impact as the untreated sewage. So to myself and the Save Windermere campaign, it's very, very straightforward what has to happen, which is to end sewage pollution in Windermere. So what will your parties do to end sewage entering Windermere?
Okay, just to say as well, I have got a statement from United Utilities who weren't invited to be here today, but they did want to make a statement, and we thought it would be fair to read that statement out, which I will do at the end of this. Phil, can you start? We started with Pippa for the last question. Could you start with this particular question?
Yeah, sure. You can read the United Utilities thing first or not?
No, I'm going to do that at the end.
Fine. So stopping things going into Windermere, I agree with the point. So basically, yes, there are potentially lots of pollutants, but it comes back to United Utilities as the primary one, and therefore the answer is to tackle United Utilities. And it seems to me you've got two different problems. You've got a problem with United Utilities as a company, and the problem is it's a public company. It's geared to making profits, it's geared to dividends, it's geared to stakeholders. It has no real interest in consumers at all. And that stems back to the way it was privatised, the way it was set up, and the way it was governed. And the only way you're going to change that is by taking it back into public ownership. And the key word there is public ownership, not nationalisation. I'm not proposing we spend £77 billion buying back this asset and then another £60 billion buying off its debt. Sorry, that's the water industry, not United Utilities. It's about using the weapons we already have, using the price controls, using the controls Ofwat has over capital spend to put the squeeze on United Utilities to the point where it either goes bankrupt or very, very close. And at that point, they will hand back the keys. So you can effectively take over a water company for nothing. So that's one answer. The other side of this is the whole question about who is regulating whom and who's in charge. And I believe that both Ofwat and the Environment Agency are fatally compromised. If we take the Environment Agency primarily as the one that's responsible for the environmental problems, not the financial problems, there are some fundamental problems with that agency. It has been, for want of a better word, corrupted by the Conservatives. It was an independent agency. It was then rammed into DEFRA and told, don't create waves in the sewage. Don't be difficult. And as a result, a whole bunch of scientists have just given up the ghost. So what we need to do with that agency is, first of all, restore its independence. So in the same way the Bank of England is independent, let's have an environment agency which is properly independent. Let's put a scientist in charge of it, not a career civil servant. And let's actually take Boris Johnson seriously for the first time in his entire life. Let's follow the science. That's what I do.
Okay.
Matt, I agree with a lot of what Phil just said. I think it's about ownership, regulation and rules. Ownership, I think, is very significant. When you've got a situation where the water companies are, well, over the time since they were privatised, taking the best part of £70 billion out of the water industry and put it in the pockets of their shareholders, most of whom are big corporations overseas, money that should have gone into the water infrastructure in the first place, and you've got them paying themselves dividends, £60 million a year and so on. This is outrageous. That's money that could go into the infrastructure. Conversations we had online just the other week with some academics, you'll know this, Matt, but others were sharing with me that if we simply prevented the dividends and the bonuses and reinvested that in the water network, you'd have a 25% increase in the resource overnight without putting a penny on bills or tax. And so how do you achieve that? My proposal is that we should strip the water companies of their licences I do that by, and I'll come back to regulation in a moment, we can't do that by setting up a new regulator, the Clean Water Authority, take the licences of the water companies immediately, and they become not-for-profit community benefit corporations. I wouldn't nationalise for all the reasons that Phil said. I don't want to put another penny back in the shareholders' pockets or in the chief executive's pockets or anybody like that. I want any spare money we've got to go back into our waterways. Regulation. So we've got kind of inadequate form of regulation at the moment. You've got, if you like, the environmental regulator, the Environment Agency, and you've got the sort of business regulator, Ofwat, and they're both compromised, either by a lack of resource or revolving door between the water industry and many people at the heads of both of those organisations. And when it comes to Ofwat, we've seen, you know, people, we now know only through Freedom of Information Act requests that have discovered Ofwat being wined and dined by chief executives of water industry bosses, industry companies around the country. And then the law, the rules, is about what is allowed. The outrageous thing is that the majority of what we are rightly angry about when it comes to Windermere is perfectly legal, which is an absolute flipping outrage. And so things need to be made illegal. Before the election, I proposed a vote in Parliament to make the dumping of sewage into waterways like Windermere a criminal offence. And only myself and I think Caroline Lucas, to be fair, and the Lib Dems actually voted in favour of that, to criminalise those acts, not just simply to be civil offences. So we need to crack down on that, and it needs a complete overhaul of the system, because at the moment the water industry is running rings around us. The billions of pounds they're in debt is mostly debt they've racked up to pay dividends, not to pay a penny when it comes to improving our infrastructure. And you're right about the balance of the blame and culpability is principally with the water industry.
Thank you, Tim. Pippa.
Let me just say, first of all, thank you for everything that you've done with the Save Windermere campaign and the way that you've drawn attention to this issue. The way that you've drawn attention to the issue both here, but also the national impact that the Save Windermere campaign has had as well is, you know, remarkable. But shouldn't have had to do it. That's the question. You shouldn't have had to, you know, a citizen-led campaign, fundraising its own money, shouldn't have been the reason that this issue has gone up the national agenda. And what this means is that the government's been asleep at the wheel on this, frankly. So let me say, first of all, how much this is a priority for a Labour government if we're elected on the 4th of July. So Keir Starmer's written in the Westmorland Gazette saying that, you know, some of you might have seen his party election broadcast that was filmed in Little Langdale. So Keir spent a lot of his childhood holidays here, knows the area really well, obviously did that party election broadcast, and has written in the Westmorland Gazette about his fury about what's being done to our water up here. We've also had the Shadow Environment Secretary, Steve Reid, I know has also lent his support and said that cleaning Windermere will be a big part of a Labour policy platform. So what would a Labour government do if we're elected on 4th of July? We would like to see a regulator with teeth. And what that means is changing the incentives around pollution so that the incentive to pollute isn't more appealing than the regulatory consequences. And what that means in practice is automatic and severe fines for pollution. We have many of the regulatory levers there already, they're just not being used. It means making the bosses personally criminally liable for sewage dumping. If we'd had this measure, then 6 out of the 9 bonuses paid to bosses would have been able to have been suspended by the government recently. So it's taking their bonuses off them, it's making the bosses personally criminally liable, and it's making those fines severe and automatic so that the incentive to pollute is not there.
Would Labour renationalise the water companies?
We don't want to take on that debt, as Tim and Phil have said. There's £70 billion of debt there to be taken on, and we don't want to do that. We believe that many of the regulatory tools are already there and they already exist, and they just need to be used by a government that's got its full attention on this issue and isn't asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any discussion between yourselves or if you all completely agree on this particular question. I'm not sure you entirely agree on everything.
We broadly do. I suspect, I don't put words in other people's mouths. I suspect, I'll speak for me. I think privatisation of the water industry was an absolute outrage and a terrible, terrible, terrible error. Yep. And I could have told you that at the time, and many of you will have thought so at the time. For what it's worth, it was always obvious when you privatise a big outfit like the water industry that ownership was going to end up not in the hands of, you know, your small middle class shareholder, but in huge corporations overseas, which is exactly what has happened. But I agree with Phil and Pippa that it is a wiser use of public money to help invest in an expanded infrastructure and a better regulator than it is to buy back the infrastructure and take on the debt. And given that debt came about by the companies paying dividends to their shareholders, what a double outrage if we ended up as taxpayers paying them twice to buy that back. So that's why I semi-reluctantly don't believe in renationalisation, but there's a sensible way around it.
Just a quick question. I mean, would you get rid of the Environment Agency? Would you completely restructure all of the... Yeah, starting with you.
Well, so no.
Right.
I think there are two problems with the Environment Agency. One is a lack of resource, and the other is a lack of focus. So let's get them to be responsible for flooding and resilience, but take the regulatory stuff off them and give that to a much, much more powerful new regulator, which would have Ofwat's powers too, plus.
I agree to a point. I think my concern is, I don't think it's primarily about resources. So yes, the agency has been stripped of resources. Yes, you could have more. But the statistics I've read say there's something like 13,400 people in the Environment Agency. They are not bureaucrats. They are mostly scientists. They're mostly dedicated people. They want to sort this stuff out. Do you want to guess how many of them are dedicated at the moment to looking at sewage plants? 91. That's political pressure. That's somebody saying, don't investigate. And there are credible accounts from whistleblowers of people saying, when they did investigate, they were told not to. If they persisted, they were moved, reallocated to different, less satisfying work until they left. That's what you get when you get ministers who talk to civil servants who don't get it, but get what's going to further their carears.
Pippa, do you want to add anything to this?
My concern is a rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of scenario. So, we can faff around with, arguing who's got powers here, who's got powers there, we're scrapping this and we're putting all of this back together. But we have the tools that we can use right now. They're just not being used properly and there isn't the political will to drive that. So I think we can get on with it, to be quite honest.
Okay, Matt, have you heard anything that will allow you to reclaim your days and not have to be standing outside the UU office? What do you think?
Not quite. I think each candidate saying something that is of interest in this particular topic, and things from Tim saying about the reform of the regulation, Pippa delving into do we just enforce current legislation? It's all credible points. The issue that really lies within this system is that pollution is profitable in this country.
Yeah.
And that's why we're seeing this happen to Lake Windermere, is because they're prioritising dividend return over the environmental protection of our lake.
Yeah.
Okay, I did mention earlier that I've got a statement from United Utilities. They contacted Friends of the Lake District and they asked for this statement to be read out because they're not represented here tonight. And they dispute some of the figures that have been used in this election campaign. They say that since the year 2000, and you can, I'm going to read it, you can take away what you will. Since the year 2000, United Utilities has invested more than £75 million upgrading wastewater treatment sites, pumping stations and sewers around Windermere. And they add that £45 million of that was only completed in 2020. They say Ambleside and Windermere treat wastewater to very high standards using the best available technology. The Environment Agency's source apportionment model, now I don't know what that is, you may well, perhaps, shows that our investment has reduced total phosphorus in Windermere by 30%. They say independent scientists from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology have said that the amount of phosphorus in the lake peaked in the mid-1990s and is now reducing, helped by the investment that we have made. They say that they use ultraviolet treatment to kill bacteria, and that helps the lake retain an excellent rating for its 4 bathing waters. And they say that they plan to invest a further £41 million into the Windermere catchment by 2030, with 19 million of that already underway to reduce the storm overflow spills by 50% at Elterwater, Hawkshead, Ambleside and near Surrey. So that's the statement we have there from United Utilities. We're going to move on to our next question this evening. And for our next question, we are going to hear from Ursula Brendling. Ursula.
Hello, good afternoon. Let me put my glasses on. The world is warming at an alarming pace. What will your party do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the changing climate?
Okay, we're going to start with Tim Farron.
First, yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is to absolutely state and be categoric that that is the case. My great worry in the last few years is that the public debate has been shifted by some, broadly in the Conservative Party, but in other parties on the right as well, and some in the media, to disbelieving some of that blindingly obvious truth. When we see that our global temperatures now are, roughly speaking, 1.5 degrees greater than they were compared to the pre-industrial age, all of the available evidence is that the world is warming and that it has catastrophic potential impacts upon the life of human beings in every corner of it, some of them predictable, some of them unpredictable, and that it is a direct consequence of human activity since the Industrial Revolution, of course, ramped up especially since the Second World War. So it's just important to keep stating that. Once upon a time, I thought we'd won that argument. And the really infuriating, distressing thing is that there's too many voices out there who will counter that for selfish reasons or just out of abject stupidity. I'm never quite sure. So what do you do about it? Keep the fossil fuels in the ground. That is what you do about it. You cannot burn fossil fuels that you have not dug up. So start now, let's talk about Cumbria, the coal mine that is potentially to be gone ahead in abeyance at the moment, recent encouraging judicial decision, that must not happen. We must make sure we do things that genuinely contribute to swiftly changing to renewables. Worth bearing in mind that during the 5 years of the coalition, we had a quadrupling in the number of renewables, and it's flatlined since. And so it's possible, with the right people in government, to actually invest in renewables, in big things. I'm a massive fan of tidal power. I think we're not using anything near enough of it. We've got the highest tidal range on the planet, apart from Canada. We use nearly none of it. We've got a government that puts artificial restrictions on land-based wind and on solar and all the rest of it. Stop doing that. Start making sure that insulating properties we already have, for those who are least well off as well as those who have got enough money, public buildings, but also making sure we transition from being a carbon-based economy to be a renewable one. So we've made great progress, but in the last few years, I fear, A, the progress has slowed, and B, the politics has changed in a terrifying way. And my sense, if we're doing a bit of crystal ball gazing about what might happen at the next election, answer none of us actually know, but one possibility is you do have a Labour government with a reasonable majority, and you've got the lights of reform and a very right-wing Tory party trying to pull them away from net zero and all that kind of thing. You will need a progressive party in decent numbers in Parliament to say, no, we need to make sure we are focused upon delivering for the green agenda, multiplying our renewables and keeping the fossil fuels in the ground.
I would dispute that and say what we need is a Labour government with a good majority, full stop, and leave it there. Because we've got very ambitious plans in our manifesto for investing in renewable energy and ending the use of fossil fuels. So it's called Great British Energy, and it's one of our 5 missions for government if we're elected on the 4th of July. And what that means is doubling our onshore wind, tripling solar power and quadrupling offshore wind, all within the first Parliament. So this is the most radical investment in renewables that we've seen in a generation, and you can have it if you vote for a Labour government. The plans are there, it's ready to go. What we've got in this country is that we are way behind many of our European counterparts in investment in renewables. And this is good for the economy too. This is a way that we can get that growth. We've got huge problems with the lack of supply chain, so we don't have the people who have the skills to retrofit our homes, insulate our houses in the way that we need. We don't have the skills out there to build the technology to create the wind turbines and innovate in solar panels in the way that we need. So we're proposing a massive green industrial transition, which is fully funded and costed in our manifesto, that will move us towards being a greener country, get us away from relying on importing our energy from other countries, will give us that energy security, and it will reduce bills. It's a win in 3 different ways, and it's a key pillar of what we would do if we elect a Labour government.
So I agree with virtually everything that's been said. I guess my only scepticism is about the timing and about the money that's being committed to this. So in 2019, we passed a milestone where we were at 50% renewable energy. As Tim said, it's pretty much flatlined since then. But what that tells me, going back to the idea of hope and not despair, is it's perfectly possible to get to 100%. You don't need special new technologies. You don't need carbon capture and other witchcraft. All you need is to put the money into the technology which already exists, already works. So let's do that. And the problem I have with Pippa's plan in particular is there was a £28 billion plan in the Labour manifesto, which became a £3.5 billion plan. If you compare that to America, Joe Biden signed into something into law called the National Investment Recovery Act or something, I can't remember what it's called. But essentially, it was an investment fund to invest in green power. It's priced at $400 billion, and the end goal is to spend $1 trillion. Now, I get it. America's a bit bigger than us, but it's not 100 times bigger. If they can afford to spend money on this kind of stuff, with the backing of the Republicans, with the backing of all the capitalist organisations, why can't we? Why can't we do more? So, yes, let's go to renewables, but let's do it faster, much, much faster, and let's be honest about the taxes that that's going to cost, because it's going to cost a lot of money. And we have committed that money. We're talking about 30 to 50 billion pounds to spend per year. Thank you.
Can I respond to Phil? If I can respond to Phil, is what we've recognised is the investment opportunity that renewables offer for the private sector as well. So while there is an amount of investment from the government and there's state investment in renewables, what that's going to do is triple the investment from the private sector into renewable energy as well. So what we're saying is that we've got lots of things that we need to work on in this country. You know, the public sector is on its knees. And if we make that investment from the state, we can create multiplier effects by putting that initial investment in and crowding in public sector and de-risking elements of it for the public sector to invest in renewables. So overall, the economic growth from it is much higher if you're not just investing from the state. It means you can go further, it means you can go faster, and it means you can get more done.
I mean, Phil, you were talking about how, you know, you're a radical. You look for radical solutions. I mean, do you go further? Do you look at large companies? Do you put a real obligation on them? Do you set targets that they have to cut their emissions by a certain amount?
I think you could, but I don't think it's the immediate priority. So if you look at where's climate change being driven from, first and foremost, it's burning fossil fuels. That's it. So tackle that first. Once you've done that for generating electricity, then you move on to the second big chunk, which is essentially transport. Once you've done that, you move on to farming. So, yeah, potentially incentives to reduce pollution down the line, but it's not where the big change is, in my view.
I think we've got to be careful who it is with taxing. I want to make sure, yeah, we should be increasing taxes, but on the oil and gas giants who have inflated profits that they did not earn at all, that's where I'd want to make sure we're gaining a lot of this money. It's also worth pointing out, I think as both of you have done to an extent, that the crucial thing here, and this is about winning the debate again, that going green and being net zero, being zero, is not a business cost. It's a business benefit. Indeed. And if you have less input costs, that makes sense, doesn't it? And so sustainability has got to be written into our economy. I think that is absolutely crucial. And we have to win that argument again. But anybody who's in business will know that if you are being sustainable, you are being economically sustainable as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to come back to Ursula. I just want to ask you a really quick question, Ursula, before you tell me how well you think they did. I mean, do you think any of the parties take net zero seriously enough? Do you think politicians take net zero seriously enough?
No, I don't think it's happened at all. I mean, what Tim is saying is very true. No one's really taken it as seriously as they should do. One of the things I do want to say, I think you've all said the right things, certainly about investing in sustainability, in new technology. But the thing is, both the Labour Party and also what you've said as well, Phil, is about building houses, and that's massive carbon emissions are from building houses, whereas we should be retrofitting houses. I mean, I look at Ambleside and I'm dismayed that the college building could be turned into low-cost low-cost retrofitted flats, and I don't understand why it's just standing empty. And I think it's looking at places that are empty and retrofitting them. It's not about building houses. That's my worry with the Labour Party. It's all about building houses, loads of new houses, which will be on the green belt, which is massive carbon emissions.
So green belt is the very, very last place that we would build any new housing. So it's brownfield first and then grey belt, which means places like car parks, petrol stations that have already been built in green belt areas. So that's we do not want to build on the green belt. We think there are options there for us to be able to build in areas where we don't have to compromise on nature. And on the retrofitting, there's over £1 billion of investment there in our Warm Homes Fund, which will be retrofitting houses and building the housing stock that we've got up to scratch. And it's also investing in the skills for plumbers, electricians, all the tradesmen people that we need to do that retrofitting and sort that out. We're investing in all of that so that we've got that as a growing sector of the economy for the future, so we've got the skills that we need.
Okay, thanks for that, Pippa. Ursula, thanks so much for that question. It was very good, particularly on an evening like this where we're all fanning ourselves. Our next question comes from Ken Taylor. Ken, where are you? Ah, there you are. Oh, right, okay. Well, I've got you down next, so
Okay, I'm ready.
I hope you're okay and sorted to ask it.
Okay, my name's Ken Taylor. I'm the hill walking representative in Cumbria Lake District for the British Mountaineering Council. Travel to crags and mountains to climb them is sort of fundamental to what we do. It is what we do. But we know how busy the roads can get around here, especially Ambleside. So how does your party propose to improve public transport, or indeed other things, so that we have an alternative to getting in our cars?
Public transport in the Lake District, getting people to hills, crags, fells, as well as probably more generally around in terms of the tourism that we have here. Pippa, it's your turn to start again.
So you might be surprised to know that at the moment local authorities don't have the ability to determine where bus routes go in their local area. So what that means is it's all determined somewhere else. So if a local authority identifies a need for a bus between, I don't know, Kendal and Langdale, they currently do not have the ability to put that in place. So what Labour's proposing, if we win on the 4th of July, is that we'll introduce franchising, which will give local authorities the ability to plan routes according to their network, which will allow them to address those needs. So to say, look, there's a community need from these urban centres, from the train stations, to take people to rural areas, recreational areas, whatever that might look like. We're going to give that power back to local authorities so that they can determine what the bus network looks like in their area. And we think that's the best way of tackling the problem, is devolving that power from central government that's removed to local government. We've done this in Manchester, where Andy Burnham is the mayor of the combined authority, and it's been a huge success. He's been able to introduce things like combined ticketing, so you can use one ticket throughout all of your buses and trains, and he's had that power to commission new routes and to make it work for the local community in Manchester. So that's what we would do. We'd give local authorities that power to be able to determine where bus routes need to go in the local area.
Anything else to add on that? I mean, say we're talking about the Lake District here. What about clogged roads up, say, Borrowdale, up Wasdale? What are you going to do about those situations? Because that's so important to lots of people who live in this constituency. It stops fire engines getting through, stops farmers doing their work, stops all kinds of people doing things they need to do.
I feel that frustration as well. I mean, working here, I think the summer of 2022 was absolutely impossible to get anywhere. It was an absolute nightmare. I would say you have to offer people sustainable transport options, and you have to promote those properly, and you have to make it really easy for people to use. So I'm talking things like transport apps, single tickets, things that make it really easy for a visitor to the area to know what to do, how they can travel from A to B. They can do it on their phones, they can do it, in the Tourist Information Centre, things that make things really simple in a joined up transport network. So I think it's offering alternatives to the car, because there is an appetite. People don't necessarily want to drive their car all the way up here from London or Manchester or Birmingham. People want to be able to travel sustainably. We've just got to give them the option to make it really easy for them.
And that sounds lovely, but is it subsidised? Who pays for it? How is that all organised? I'm sorry, I'm just cutting in a little bit here. I'm sure I'll be asking the other two the same if they'd asked given that answer too.
Yeah. It's about power and control. So it's about local authorities being able to determine where the resources are spent and what's the best for the community, rather than central government trying to determine what's best for a local community.
Okay, if they have resources, that is, I guess. So Phil, do you want to carry on?
I agree with everything Pippa said. I think in addition to that, though, we've got a more fundamental problem, which is how people think about transport. So the pyramid at the moment says, if you can, you drive. If you can't drive, you get public transport, but it's going to be rubbish. If you really can't get public transport, you go by bike, but you know that's going to be dangerous. And if you really have to, you'll walk, but my God, that's dangerous, particularly if you're living somewhere like Kendal, never mind in Langdale. And what we need to do, and it's not an easy thing to do, is we need to somehow invert that pyramid. We need to start saying that actually walking and cycling are the primary means that people should be able to get around. And we need to start restructuring cities and cycleways and pedestrian areas to make that possible. We also need to invest in public transport, as Pippa said, but it needs to be green transport. And then we need to start restricting the use of cars, frankly. So I'll paint a picture of how this fantasy world of mine might work. So if you imagine now you live in London, you want to come to Langdale for the weekend, you drive. Nobody in their right mind would go on Avanti West Coast. No, yes, enough said.
We don't have a statement from that.
And then you've got a rubbish service from Oxenholme through to Windermere, and you've probably missed the connection, haven't you, because your Avanti service was cancelled. And then you get to Oxenholme, and you get to Windermere, you say, where's the bus? Oh, the last bus left an hour ago. So let's turn that round. So let's have a fleet of small electric-powered shuttle buses that radiate out from Windermere Station. Let's have an electric train service from there back to Oxenholme, and let's take Avanti West Coast into public ownership, sort out the minor problems they've got with the train drivers, invest in some of the technology, and all of a sudden, it becomes possible to go from London to Langdale in about 3 hours. And if that's possible, who'd drive?
So I think that there are national and local solutions to all this. I think on the national side of it, I think Pippa was, getting at where I think a lot of the problem arises. So Pippa rightly says Andy Burnham's doing things in Greater Manchester. Great. That's because that's one of only 2 authorities in the country, I think, where local authorities are allowed to own and directly run public transport. And all local authorities should be allowed to do that. And so I think that's a key thing. If we were to do that, then local authorities would be able to not just plan routes, but to deliver them themselves. And if you break even, that's absolutely fine, because the value to the economy is enormous. Public transport makes very little money. You probably know this. Transport for London loses money, but what does it do to the London economy that people can move around so quickly? It keeps it going. It's an enormously valuable investment, and we need to see public transport not as a cash cow in of itself, but that it's vital to the working of any economy, particularly one like this, which is rural and dispersed. So what do you do about it? I mean, 85% of our visitors come by car. I think we can do something to get that figure down significantly, and a matter of that is public transport. I could joke that maybe the best thing about this general election is that I've not spent the last 4 weeks on an Avanti train. It's been brilliant. I've been here. But the train service, when they work, they're perfectly good. The issue we've got here is, to a degree, capacity. How could you add value and capacity here? A simple thing, which we are working on, and I think we will deliver, council is fully behind it, is to build a passing loop at Burneyside. You effectively double the capacity of the Lakes line that way, make it that much. If you've got a service every half hour, the chances of people deciding to hop on there and make that their choice of getting here is crucial. But even if you people come here by car, what do they do once they are here? And the key thing is, can you get them out of their car when they're here? And the answer is, yes, you can. So, for example, just over the way in Ullswater, the communities around Ullswater have Situ, the Sustainable Transport and Ullswater group, that manages with public subsidy and business subsidy to run a shuttle bus, which is an embryonic park and ride, effectively, to allow people to arrive somewhere central, pretty close to the motorway, pretty close to Penrith, and then be able to get to the point of whichever hill it is they're going to try and climb. That's exactly what happens in Snowdonia, by the way, with the bus services around there. So I would say it's national, change policy so you've got the ability for local authorities to run public transport, but locally there's a lot of things you can fix without the law changing. So constantly I'm working with bus companies and others to try and put back routes that we've lost, like we've done in Cartmel and Sedbergh and what have you. So even when the government doesn't help you, you can make your own luck locally, and that is what we've sought to do.
Tim. We don't have to have discussion for discussion's sake, but you were saying, Phil, what about restricting cars? I mean, would you ban cars from certain places? Is that a way to go? Because some people might say, well, that is what you have to do. You know, there is no other way. Should there be a tax on cars? If you want to take your car at Wasdale, you've got to pay £5 to do it. What do you think?
I think it's intuitively hugely attractive, but I think there are fairly significant technical problems in actually doing that. So if you look at the ULEZ scheme in London, quite apart from it being politically massively controversial with some sections of the population, it's a fairly major investment. So the idea of something that worked like ULEZ on a national scale that enable you to effectively make people pay for the damage they were doing would be lovely, but right now I think it's probably a bit beyond us. I'm a radical, but I'm not that radical.
Any other thoughts from either of you?
I think my instinct is to put alternatives in place. My instinct isn't to, ban something outright. I'm aware of people who've got access needs or who might not have any alternative means of getting around. So I think you have to put the alternatives in place that are affordable and green to encourage people to do what they would like to do.
ULEZ is uncontroversial in those bits of London where there are very clear, easy public transport alternatives. And it's become controversial in those bits of outer London where there's not. So that's a clue for us here. And one thing we maybe get onto in a moment, but the Lake District's for everybody. I'd hate the thought that the only people who could come and spend time in here are those who are wealthy enough to be able to afford to pay surcharges.
Okay, Ken, let's come back to you. What do you think about the responses you've heard? Do they satisfy your, your need for going to climb a crag somewhere?
If I'm responding, first of all, I should say this is my view, not
Okay.
because they're not
We
here to
clock that.
respond. I can think that you can give them all the incentives, the better transport, so on and so forth, but I must accept Phil's point, ultimately, that you've got to start making some carrots as well as sticks. The people I know, I'm in a local fell walking group, I'm in a mountaineering club group, they think I'm a bit eccentric because I've actually been doing the Windermere way using public transport. Boats, trains, buses. What a learning experience that's been. I've cycled here tonight, I'm a bit of a weirdo. It's not in the mindset. And I think the only way you'll get people to really change is to start using a few sticks. And it's going to be difficult in a democracy. People don't like sticks. But we have options that you could start, for example, Mardale. Nobody lives at Mardale. You could actually close that off. I think the legislation might be in place to do that. Run a park and ride scheme. Charge to go up there. Longsleddle, Kentmere. Kentmere is tricky because there's a lot of people live at Kentmere. But there are, these need to be explored and talked about. And that starts to change the mindset. So I don't think that you're being radical enough. Phil maybe is moving towards it, but recognising the difficulties. But then Phil's a climber, so.
Mindset change, really, really interesting and really, really difficult to do. I think we could even begin to go into that tonight. However, anyway, we're going to move on to our next question. And our next question comes from Steve Trotter. Steve, you've got a microphone.
Good evening.
People may recognise your name because you are, I think we should say, you're the CEO of the Cumbria Wildlife Trust.
I am indeed. I was
You
about
are.
to say that.
So, Steve, give us your question, please.
Thank you. We're in the midst of three major crises, one of which we've already had a question about, the climate emergency. We've also got a major nature crisis, a major wildlife crisis. And locally and more widely, we've also got a farming and food crisis. How would the panel incentivise and reward farming approaches that benefit wildlife and help us to mitigate and adapt to the climate emergency and break down and put wildlife back into the landscapes where we've lost it?
Okay, thank you for that question. There's quite a lot in there. And we are going to begin this time with, is it Phil? Sorry, I should have written it down. Yeah, it's Phil we're starting with this time, just to make sure everybody has their turn.
So, as the Green in the room, you'd expect me to be quite keen on biodiversity, and I am. In terms of what we can do, there already are mechanisms in place. There's something called the Environmental Land Management System, which effectively tries to move farmers away from the old model of being paid for output, which then changed to being paid for acreage to now being paid for public goods, like rewilding, for want of a better word. So that exists. I think we need more of it, and we need more money behind it. And that's one of the areas where Pippa and I think agree in terms of that's something that needs funding. But I also think we need a great deal of education to bring farmers along with us on this, because I think it's in your paperwork, 70%, 75% of this county effectively is farmed. You can't go around just rewilding things at random. You can't just regenerate things at random. You need the cooperation of the farming community. So we need to work with those people. We need to provide incentives, but you also need to provide a level of education and a level of persuasion. And I think we also need some of this to be community-led. So rather than, we're never going to get to a situation where the man from the Environment Agency knocks on the farmer's door and says, rewild or else. We want it to be local communities working with landowners to try and introduce regeneration gradually. That's what I'd suggest.
Farron.
Yeah. It's a massive question. So 72% of England is agricultural land. So if we care about climate change or the biodiversity crisis, and we don't take agriculture seriously, and people working in it seriously, and see them as our ultimate partners, we will fail. Totally fail. So I'm going to say something to you surprisingly, so something maybe surprising, and that is that I have discovered a Brexit benefit. And I think leaving the Common Agricultural Policy is a good thing. And I think the opportunity to set up a new bespoke system, Environmental Land Management Scheme, Phil's already mentioned it, which is the government's umbrella scheme for the future, gives us opportunities to do what all parties say they agree with, and I do, to provide public money for public goods. However, what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years is your average farmer in Cumbria has got an income now less than 41% less than it was 4.5 years ago. And that's for a combination of reasons, but bluntly, because they have predictably and very rapidly phased out the old system and very haphazardly brought in the new stuff. So 100% of farmers will have lost 50% of their basic payment this year, and about a fifth of them have got anything new to replace that. And so what's happening, and one of the reasons why that's the case, is that so many of our farmers are either tenants or they're small holders, and they are busy, and they are knackered, and they are scared. You're working 90 hours a week, and you are somebody who has got, you're the 5th generation that's farmed that farm, and because the transition, and because the government is frankly botching the transition, you are staring down the funnel of you being the one who loses the family farm after 5 or 6 generations. What does that do to your head? What does that do to you? And we are reaching a moment of serious crisis, mental health crisis, in our rural communities that we are not on top of. And not only is that awful and tragic in itself, these people are not being helped into the new scheme. So what do you do about it? There is £2.4 billion in the pot for England for ELMS, for the new schemes. The government is only spending 2.2 billion of it because they haven't invested in what they need to do to get the money out of the door. It's principally going into the hands of big wealthy landlords and those people who don't necessarily need the money, and it's not going to people who really need it. So we would put an extra billion into that, and we give a large chunk of that to Natural England. Now, if you talk to your average farmer does not think Natural England are great, by the way. But I would say a lot of farmers who are ahead of the game, I won't name them because I've not asked their permission, but people you will have heard of, will say that one of the problems of the smaller farmers, vast landscape, like vast area, but small businesses, one of the problems of them getting into the environmental schemes is there's no one they trust to hold their hand through the process so they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, that it is worth carrying on, that you can produce the food the country needs and you can help to restore nature. As things stand, we are harming our environment and we are seriously harming the people we rely on to feed us, and both those things are a tragedy and it's fixable.
Thanks, Tim.
So I won't say too much more about ELMS other than that a Labour government, so we recognise there's a big underspend there and more needs to be done to get the money out the doors, and we're all broadly in favour of the public goods for public money approach.
And ELMS are the environmental land management schemes that were brought in to replace the basic payment that has gone now that we've come out of the EU, so it's Tim's Brexit benefit.
Yeah, well, sorry. But what a Labour government would do would be to introduce a land use framework, because we recognise there's lots of different calls on our land that we've got to match up. So what we would do is put something in that recognises that we have to promote sustainable regenerative farming in a way that guarantees farmers' incomes and works with nature, also meets our climate goals. So we want farmers to be able to introduce natural flood defence mechanisms to mitigate from the effects of the climate change that we've discussed is already happening, but also strengthen our ecosystems, so bringing back nature into areas where it's been lost. So we would introduce that framework that looks at our land as a whole and identifies how we marry these different incentives all together so that we can farm in a way that produces the food that we need in this country and restores nature and mitigates against climate change as we're seeing already.
Can I say there's not a lot of detail in the Labour manifesto about farming, and there is no mention of budget for farming in the Labour manifesto. I mean, the Greens, I think I've got your manifesto here, it's talking about a vast amount of money for the farming system. Financial support for farmers to be almost tripled to support their transition to nature-friendly farming, which is, I guess, kind of one of the things we're talking about here. The Lib Dems, £1 billion every year for the new Parliament. The Conservatives, £1 billion over the Parliament. Labour said nothing, and of course Labour's talking lots about health, about education, about all sorts of things. There are so many demands. So where's the money going to come from?
Lots of competing priorities there. So what we've said is that we'd consider farming as part of a first spending review if we were to elect a Labour government. So it is on the agenda, and that's once we've sat down, identified where's the issues. There is money in ELMS. So as we said, there's billions that haven't actually got out of the door yet. So there is money there to be spent. What we will do is sit down, look at the plan, put this framework in, working in partnership with various stakeholders, and then identify the money to be spent, where it's going to come from, what that's going to look like.
Okay, Tim, do you have something to say at
Well,
this point?
my real worry is, with this government and a future one, is that the Treasury is almost always very, 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 very powerful in any government. And my deep worry is, Treasury officials and ministers in the Treasury looking at a department that has underspent its budget by 10 or 20%, think, oh, you don't need that. And that terrifies me, because we need more than that. We've just botched the transition. And so I desperately hope that if we do have a Labour government, there will be voices within that government, and I will be using my power, should you return me, to make them realise that the only reason we haven't spent the money is not because we don't need it, because the government screwed up the transition.
Okay. Any other comments about farming for nature, I guess, as well, and about bringing back habitats, improving biodiversity, and the role that farming has to play in that? Because I think that was kind of what your question was getting at, Stephen,
Yes,
wasn't
it
it?
was, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I'd throw into this is we shouldn't blame farmers for the mess we're in. Post-war, Second World War, farmers were beaten over the head and told, you must make us food secure, you must farm intensively, you must increase the density of crops, you must grow more sheep, everything. And they were paid and paid and paid to do exactly that. They were punished if they didn't. If farmers left field edges tidy, they could be fined. And they did what they were told to do. And in the process, they slaughtered, decimated, whatever the word is, wildlife, and they also did huge amount of damage to their own farms. Most of the land in this country has been under immense pressure for 75 years, with too much pesticides, too many chemicals, too much fertilizer, and we need to fundamentally change that. And that's a really difficult message for farmers to hear, and it's going to be really difficult because it pushes all the buttons in terms of food security, because it means we are going to have to accept that we produce less food. Sorry? Because that's the only way we can get farming back into balance with the natural world again.
So I'm not being rude here. That's the Liz Truss position, which is...
God, no.
Sorry. I don't mean to be mean. I was being slightly facetious. There is a branch of thinking, super free market thinking, which is, we'll just import all our food. And the problem is, so I think we need to produce more food, not less. But people who are at the head of regenerative farming will tell you you can get more out of the land than we currently do if you farm it wisely in a regenerative way. So that's entirely possible. So producing less food, I think, is bad for the environment because we just have to import it from other people. And it's also dangerous in an international security point of view. The other thing I want to say about environmental incentives and funds for land managers and farmers is I am deeply suspicious about some of the schemes. I am not a fan of offsetting. The idea that a massive corporation gets away with doing terrible, terrible, terrible things if only it buys up a great big tract of land, kicks off the farmers and grows probably the inappropriate, not the right sort of trees. If we want to stop big corporations doing bad, dirty things full stop, don't give them a chance to offset it, just stop them doing it full stop. And when we're doing regenerative farming, do genuine regenerative farming. One of the real problems, and I would love us to get over this, is that this view that somehow there's a conflict between producing food and caring for the environment. No, there's not. You can do both well. We just haven't done so far.
Stephen Trosser, can I bring you back in? What do you think about what you've heard this evening?
We probably haven't got time left this evening, but lots of really positive things, I think, generally. But I think the big issue is we've got to remember that the natural world provides everything we need for our lives, all our fulfillment, enjoyment, and we are seriously undermining its ability to support us. So it's time, politicians of all parties took this really seriously, and in some ways we ought to be moving to almost like a war footing in terms of addressing the climate emergency and the wildlife crisis, because it really is the challenge of whether we can survive as a species on this planet. We're getting to that stage, I think. So not wanting to sound too over gloomy, but we need to take it seriously. We need to start to put 30% of our landscapes into good condition for nature recovery by 2030 and beyond, as we've signed up to internationally. So there's a lot to do, and we've got to be determined and invest in putting nature back where we've lost it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Stephen. All right, we have already touched on tourism and transport this evening, and we're going to take a question now about tourism and homes for locals, I think is the theme, really. It comes from Elizabeth Howarth. Elizabeth, where are you? Excellent, thank you, Elizabeth. Give us your question, please.
My question is, how do we stop losing our current local homes to the tourist industry, which may be run from outside Cumbria, and therefore siphoning money off the county?
Did we all get that?
I noticed that Barcelona has the same problem because they were in the news this morning. A local friend took over a year when they wanted to find a house in Windermere to downsize. Another friend had lived in Bowness for 50 years. When she died, her house is now a holiday home, or shall we say holiday accommodation by the week. So housing in Bowness and Windermere is not very easy to find.
So Elizabeth, thank you. Your question, how do we stop losing our local homes to the tourist industry and perhaps to tourist industry outsiders where the money from those tourists doesn't even stay in the area? Let us begin with Tim Farron.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, sometimes people ask, particularly journalists will ask, what's the biggest issue in your patch? And it's always difficult to settle on one, but this would be a serious contender to be the issue, housing. And it's about what we do with our current housing stock. So the fact that we are leaking a torrent of permanent homes into the non-permanently occupied sector, shall we say, second homes and short-term lets, has an enormous impact. So we lose so many young people, so many other families who just cannot stay here. That's tragic for families that are effectively ejected from the place that they were brought up and cannot, other people can't relocate here if they're not on good incomes. But what does that mean for the economy? I mean, there's a sense in which the tourism economy is kind of eating itself, because what we have is 63%, last time I checked, of all hospitality businesses in the Lake District working below capacity because they can't find enough staff. I was in Haverthwaite last summer, and I remember having a chat with the landlord there. A lovely American couple came in for lunch. There was no lunch, there was no chef. He very kindly redirected them off to Cartmel or somewhere, I think. And he told me after they'd gone out of earshot, they're staying in the house that my chef lived in last year. That's your microcosm of the problem. And the same case for social care, for education, everything. So apart from the moral thing that it's just not right that we've got a housing economy that doesn't provide homes for local families, local people, it's also crippling the local economy more broadly. So what do we do about it? And I think there's a couple of things. There's fiscal and there's planning. I think planning will do more good. I am right behind the council's plan to double council tax on second homeowners for next year. Absolutely behind that. I'm not convinced it'll make an enormous difference. If you can afford an extra house for 700 grand, reasonable chance you can afford an extra 2 grand a year in council tax. But if the council ring fences that money and puts into the communities that suffer towards affordable housing, it'll do some good. The thing that'll make a big difference is making short-term lets and second homes separate categories of planning use, in which case the National Park or the council, depending on where you live, can actually put a lid on the number of homes that leak out of permanent occupancy. And it's not because, the tourism economy is vital. It's our biggest employer in Cumbria. It's of huge benefit to us, and we should be a window to the world. We should encourage people here. But you can have a situation where you end up just gobbling up the housing stock that local people would live in. And I've got nothing personally against second homeowners. I'm always really careful about my language. We mustn't demonise anybody, but we have to stop allowing so much of our housing stock to bleed out of local occupancy, because if we do, we will have dead communities. And the final thing is, anything we build that's new has got to be genuinely affordable. I don't just mean 80% of market value, because what's 400 grand rather than 500 grand doesn't make it affordable. We have to give powers to local authorities to force developers to build genuinely affordably, and secondly, let's go back. I'm not in favour of turning the clock to the 1950s for most things, but for building council houses, I totally am. Let's give local authorities the power and the resource to build council houses that don't bleed off into the private sector.
If we're talking about social, affordable and council houses, I'm afraid you have to vote for a Labour government, because that's a key pillar of what we're going to do if we're elected as the biggest genuinely social and council housing building programme in a generation, and also build to rent as well. We don't talk about renters enough in this area. As a younger person who lives there, who's bought my first house not that long ago, this is very much top of mind for me, how difficult it is to rent in this area and to save the deposit that you need in order to buy a house and get that first step on the housing ladder. If we return specifically to the issue of second homes and holiday lets, what a Labour government would do is introduce a licensing system for holiday lets, because at the moment we have a kind of tax loophole where you can say that your residence is a second home. So what we want to do is create a register for holiday lets so we know where they are in the communities, because that's the first step to being able to manage housing in the best interests of the communities. And that's how we balance the incentives of local people being able to access local jobs, being able to afford the houses in the areas that they need to live in, and also protecting our tourism industry. So what I'm looking for is a kind of balanced approach. So I'm looking for the ability to understand where our second homes and holiday lets are, and having that licensing in place so that we know exactly where they are in the community, so that we can start to manage that in the best way for the communities.
And do you call Airbnb a holiday let?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that fits in there as well, because there's so many Airbnbs around nowadays. I'm sure you're all quite aware.
We can see it when we go out canvassing. You know,
Yeah.
I've been amazed as I've been going across the constituency, the number of places that have got lockboxes and they've got named. We think, well, that's a holiday let. So places like Staveley, where when I was at school, a lot of my teachers lived in Staveley. That was, a really, really kind of strong community.
Yeah.
And going around there a few weeks ago, I was amazed at how many I think are now holiday lets.
Yeah. I'm sure lots of people have noticed that. Phil?
Okay. Unusually, if I must have agreed with everything these two people have said.
Good Lord.
Sorry, I won't last. So, yeah, absolutely. We need to use effectively always planning controls to limit change of use. So you've got a choice, it's either a residential property or it's a holiday let or it's a second home, and it moves between those categories at the discretion of the council. And you would expect the council to take into account things like what's the current density of holiday homes, what's the current density of second homes. And the presumption would be against second homes. Like I would say, we do not want any more second homes at all, unless there's an incredibly powerful reason. And the assumption would also be against holiday homes, frankly, unless there's a very low density in that particular area. And the reason for this is not about, as Tim said, it's not about being unpleasant to holiday owners. We want people to come and have holidays here. We don't want to penalise second homeowners, but we've got a housing crisis. When I left university, I was paid £7,000 a year, which seemed like a fortune. I went out and bought a house after 1 year, and it cost me £21,000. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. In this area now, the ratio is 9-to-1. There is absolutely no way that local people, or children of local people more realistically, can buy houses in this area. They just can't. They have to move out, which contributes to the problem that Tim was talking about in terms of just people fleeing. So we absolutely need affordable housing, and that's building affordable houses, and it's also building houses to rent. And that will require some investment. The previous Conservative government had a policy, it missed its target every single year for 14 years. Yeah. That requires pressure from government on developers. I don't buy this story that it's always difficult getting planning. No, it isn't. All the major developers have got huge banks of land which they've got planning permission on. The reason they're not building is because they want to maximise their profits by limiting supply. So let's put some pressure on those people. Yeah? If you're not prepared to build the houses, that's fine. We'll revoke your planning permission. We'll give it to somebody who does want it. Somebody who is prepared to build and is prepared to build for local people, because that's what our priority should be.
Absolutely.
Any more? Any more comments on this?
I agree with all of that. I think
Yeah.
the key point Phil's getting at there is that the community should remain in control. What really, really bugs me is and Phil mentioned this at a previous hustings as well, he's right then too, and you'll see developers who will get planning permission to build, say, 100 houses, and the council will use what limited powers they've got to maybe get 25 affordable homes out of that 100 houses. The developer then turns up on site and goes, oh, we found a few rocks there we didn't expect to find, we can only afford to do 2. And that's happened, by the way. And the council will push that. And we had it was a test case at Allithwaite, by the way, at Jack Hill at Allithwaite. The council said, not on your Nelly. You said you're building, 30% affordable homes. You build those 30% affordable homes. And we went to the government for support, and they would not give it us. And the council ended up losing the case, and the developer builds 60 unaffordables and 2 affordables. And exactly what Phil says, we should be in a situation where if we say to a developer says that to us, we say, well, okay, we now appreciate you can't deliver what you said you were going to deliver. You've lost your planning permission. That's now not happening, and we'll treat with somebody who will build affordables.
Okay. Elizabeth, what do you make of what our candidates have had to say this evening?
Well, one of the things that worries me about what's being said at the moment is we can't just go on building houses. There won't be any green grass left, and we'll just have to thank Beatrix Potter and the National Trust for any landscape.
Okay. All right, thank you for your contribution, and thanks for a really good question as well. We're going to move on to our next question, and our question that we have next tonight is about the Lake District National Park, and it comes from Richard Tate. Richard, wait for your microphone. Here it comes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Hi, Richard Tate. My question is about the future direction of the Lake District National Park. My views are remarkably similar to those of the Friends of the Lake District, which I'm a member, in that I believe there has been a trend towards overdevelopment by commercial interests in the park, and there should be a return to the original aims of the National Park. And, you know, I'm sure that holds good in national parks elsewhere in the UK as well. What are the views of the candidates, and as a specific example, would they, or did they, oppose the recently approved zip wire facility at Elterwater? Now, just a caveat to that, I've heard since I put in this question that Friends of the Lake District are actually planning to appeal this decision. So I guess an additional one for the candidates is, do you support that appeal?
Okay. Would it be useful if I just give a tiny bit of context here? National Park designated and established in 1951 under the National Parks and Access to Countryside Act for the preservation and enhancement of natural beauty in England and Wales and the provision and improvement of opportunities for open-air recreation. So I guess those were the original aims of the National Park. Then the Environment Act in 1995 revisited those aims, and the Lake District National Park Authority's statutory purposes now are to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the Lake District National Park, and to promote opportunities for the understanding and enjoyment of the specific qualities, the special qualities of the National Park by the public. And it also has a duty in pursuing those purposes to seek to foster the economic and social well-being of local communities within the National Park by working closely with agencies and local authorities responsible for those matters, but without incurring significant expenditure. And I guess where we're talking about, I suppose, is the economic part, perhaps, is where it comes in. So to start us off answering this question, Pippa, if you could
Sure. So
take the floor.
I want to see a national park that is wild and that is green and that works for nature and that gives you that opportunity for solitude and the proper immersion in nature. I don't want to see a kind of sanitized, chocolate boxy national park. I want something that's that moves you. That's something that's really important to me. So I want to see nature restored across the park, and I want to see it accessible to people who are looking for that escape and that ability to really appreciate the landscapes and the wildlife that we've got in this area that's unique for the country. So that's what I want to see for the park. In terms of development specifically, I think there is a balance to be struck. I'm not against, any possible development that could be in the park. I think we, should kind of move with the times and have those kind of opportunities in place that we need to support our tourism industry and to provide rich experiences for people who visit this area. I'm in favour of attractions that work with that mantra. so that don't damage our environments and provide support for the communities that live there and give people that kind of access to that level of experience. So what I would do if you elect me is to work with the various parties involved in this. So to work with the National Park Authority, with organisations like the Friends of the Lake District, and with the developer as well, to understand really what this means for our area in terms of what's the benefit that we can expect from offering people another way of experiencing our national park, but equally what downsides would we see and how can we mitigate that in a way that works for the communities that are most affected by it.
And the final part of the question there was that Friends of the Lake District has launched a legal challenge to the development, the one at Elterwater. Do you support them or do you not support them in that?
I would have to kind of know the specifics of it, to be quite honest, to know exactly the nature of what the objection is and on what grounds. But if I'm elected, I would work with all parties to kind of understand the situation and the position there.
Okay, Phil.
Okay. I was one of the 90,000 people who did object, and I objected. This has got to be an own goal with this audience, really. I objected for the same reasons I think most of you did. One, why build a theme park in one of the most congested valleys in Cumbria? It's just an utterly bizarre decision. The traffic congestion to me is secondary to that, but still in the revised planning submission, I believe they've not really addressed that. They're still playing at it. I find it genuinely baffling. I do not understand how 90,000 people can object to something and 7 people on the board of the planning authority can say, well, we'll go ahead anyway. And I do wonder whether there's something wrong in terms of the remit of that authority and whether it's not too beholden, as you implied, to economic interests rather than what the vast majority of people in this area actually want. So, yeah, you are absolutely right to oppose it. Yes, I opposed it. Yes, I absolutely support your appeal against it. I genuinely do not understand the logic at play here.
Yeah, I also objected and opposed the zip wire proposal, not because I'm against zip wires, and they can, perfectly legitimate thing to do, and maybe you can have such a thing in the Lake District, but for those very reasons, well, for 2 reasons. Fundamentally, because we'd be attracting vast amounts of additional traffic into a very congested couple of valleys. It just seems ludicrous. There's no management plan that will be able to deal with that. On top of that, by the way, there's the opportunity cost of what we could refer to as a brownfield development, couldn't we? And what would have been better to have done there would have been to build some affordable housing. That would be a much better use of that space if somebody wanted to make a commercial use of that quarry site. But yeah, I objected to it and I will continue to object to it. Not a NIMBY, I just think what a stupid thing to do in the middle of a very congested tiny valley. We've already got problems with ambulances getting to people and all the rest of it. It just feels very, very daft. On the issue about, so I think this is a really big, philosophical issue about what the national park is for. And Kaz was sort of setting those things out, which I think we refer to as the Sanford principles. And aren't they preservation, kind of access stroke education. And then the thing that got added in the 90s is some thought about the well-being of the community that actually lives here. I often think that's the one that's most overlooked, by the way. And what we were talking about earlier on, about, if you like, the second one, the access education, what really basically means a tourism economy, gobbling up the homes that would be lived in by local people is a real tension, and we need to kind of reorder that. The national park here is different to the others. If you think Northumbria National Park has got about 1,500 people who live in it as their full-time home. The Lake District National Park is Britain's most populated, with nearly 50,000 people who live here full-time. And so it's really, really, really important that we make sure that the national park operates in a way which preserves local communities. But yes, preserving the landscape is critical. And that's where Elms comes in. You've got a single tool, while working with landowners and farmers and all other land managers, where you can genuinely make a difference and shift the dial within probably 5 years in a really, really positive way. And I also think, let's be positive about other parties. Harold Macmillan in the 50s built council houses. Well done him. That was a great Conservative thing to do. And the Labour Party, the national parks are a remarkable achievement. And there is something fundamentally, dare I say it, egalitarian and socialist about the national parks, the whole idea of them. It's about the fact that they're not just for people who are well off enough to be able to afford to live here. They're for absolutely everybody. And so access and education to the lakes is crucial. But what's the point in access to the lakes and education about the lakes if we'd have allowed it to become a theme park? and if we've undermined the tranquility and all the things that Pippa rightly says are so important. So I think there's a time for a rebalancing of the Sanford principles. I think number 1 is underrated and number 3 is underrated. Number 2 sometimes is overrated.
So thank you. Anything else to add, anybody? Anything that you want to pick up on, pick the other candidates up on, really, or not?
Not really.
Not really. Okay. And I think we're all getting quite hot. So I think what I'll do is I will go back to our questioner. Richard, what do you make of what the candidates have had to say?
Well, quite encouraging, really. I got a straight answer from 2 out of the 3 candidates, which I think is pretty good for a political meeting.
You
But,
cynic,
try
you.
not to be cynical. I think the points that have been made, go some way to reassuring me that these sort of issues are at the forefront. I understand there's a whole wide spectrum of policies that need to be looked at, but it seems to me, and I don't want to be a stick in the mud, but the whole point that we're in danger of losing the very thing that we tried to create with the national parks in 1951 or whatever it is. Now, I don't want to be elitist. I don't want to be, somebody who wants to stick, I think the phrase is used, keep the place stuck in aspic or some phrase like that. I don't want to be accused of that, but I think, my concern, and I do live here, is just that we destroy the golden goose, really.
It's a really fine balance, isn't it? And I think our candidates did really well answering that because it is such a hard balance.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have another question. Thank you. We have another question to come from Liz Hendry. Liz, where are you? Aha. There we go.
Thank you. This really touches on some of the points that have been made earlier on the economic side. Electric vehicles are very expensive both to buy and to charge, whether at home or on motorways or whatever. How would you support people, many of whom live in the Lake District, on lower incomes to make the green transition?
Good question. Phil, we need to start with you this time.
Oh dear. I think I'd start maybe at the other end of the question, which is let's make people less poor. So a couple of principles of the Green Party programme are increasing minimum wages and also removing the cap on child benefit. That's a mouthful. And we've also talked about affordable housing, and we discussed house building. We've also talked on our programme about insulating houses, because the logic being the cheapest fuel bill is the one you don't pay because your house is so well insulated, you don't have to incur it in the first place. So first of all, for me, that's a priority, is actually tackling the poverty that makes it difficult to live in this place in the first place. In addition to that, then clearly there needs to be some kind of investment in a network of charging points to make it easier to go and actually get your vehicle charged up. Beyond that, honestly, I'm not sure there is a huge amount that can be done. The trend, if you like, with renewable power is the more you get of it, the cheaper it becomes, and you start to get to a critical mass where things do become cheaper, and you start to hard bake that technology into every aspect of our society. And I think that's more what we need to work on. I don't think there's a magic solution that suddenly gives you cheap electricity. It's more about the enablers. To link back to the question, we talked about homes earlier. There's a house that's been built near me. It's an affordable home. It's £729,000 for 6 bedrooms. It doesn't have solar power. It doesn't have a heat pump. It doesn't have ground source. It doesn't have EV charging. Nothing. And that's what we need to change. We need to get to a point where all of those things are actually built into, hardwired into every aspect of our society, because that then makes it possible for people to do those things a lot more cheaply, in my view.
Very good. Yeah, Liz, it's a great question, and I absolutely agree. I mean, I think poverty is the fundamental bar to all forms of liberty. It's the thing that most saps you of your freedom to do the things that you want to do and would think are the right thing to do. So I think, obviously, what we do about vehicles is critically important, although the houses that we live and work in are about 4 times more guilty, so to speak, of emissions than the vehicles that we drive. But just looking at vehicles, put bluntly, no one would drive a petrol or a diesel car if they could never fill one up easily. And if you couldn't access relatively affordable second, third, fourth-hand cars. One encouraging thing I came across recently going to Kendal College, I was looking at the mechanics there, learning how to build a second-hand electric vehicle market, because that's crucial. You're only going to get people to transition in large numbers when these vehicles become affordable in and of themselves, and then are easy to charge and to charge well. And so many people live on streets where it's just simply not possible or easy in any way safely to be able to charge from your property. And so we need to make sure that there are communal centres, right, and far more than we currently have. The council and the national park can do a lot to help with that, as can other businesses. That is critical. But going back to the issue about making it all affordable, and as Phil suggested, I mean, properties are allowed to be built with no kind of insulation, with no kind of renewable energy installed within it. And for a brief window, for an exciting 14-month window at the back end of the coalition, they did have to, because we had zero carbon homes, and then they become optional. And as soon as they become optional, developers don't need to have them. And so you need to make zero carbon homes the standard and enforceable at the planning stage. So everything new has to be built to be compliant, not only in terms of energy efficiency, but in terms of generating your own clean energy as part of the package. And on top of that, we need to recognise that, you know, the majority of homes people live in already exist. And so what do you do to retrofit those? And Pippa made a really important point, because it's all great having super ideas about how we do these things. If you're not got a workforce to deliver it, that's a big problem. So we need to generate that, and that will take some time to do that. But we can, for example, change the way we do the insulation packages so that they fit single-skinned older Lake District properties. And that takes some bespoke stuff that currently the Eco Plus scheme doesn't support. So let's make sure we have retrofitting schemes that actually work for the kinds of houses that we do. I would say the Blair government did a really good job of the low-hanging fruit, doing the easy stuff, and it did a very good job of that from 97 through to probably about 2005. What no government since, Labour, Coalition or Conservative, have managed to do is to really get forward when it comes to retrofitting the stuff that is harder to do. And if we don't do that, we'll be wasting whatever energy it is we do produce, whether it's from renewable or other sources.
Pippa.
I'll just briefly pick up on a few points there. So, yeah, absolutely agree that new houses built need to have this infrastructure in place, firstly for generating their own renewable energy, but also for having the charging points that we need. Labour will invest £1 billion in retrofitting homes as well, so that will mean having the amenities that they need for charging points, as well as insulation, retrofitting, all of that we need. One point that I don't think has been made properly yet is that we need to upgrade the electricity grid to allow this to happen. If we're putting all of this renewable energy in that we're going to be doing through Great British Energy, and we are, you know, encouraging people to electrify so that we can get fossil fuels out of our system, what we need is a grid that can support that. And at the moment, some new developments are being given a waiting time of 15 years to connect to the grid. So we've got a huge problem with our electricity capacity at the moment. That's part of what Labour will tackle through our reforms of the planning system, through our housing policy and through our clean energy policy as well, is upgrading the grid that we need so that we can electrify and put those renewable energies in.
We seem to have some consensus here, so I'm wondering about just going straight back to Liz, if that's okay. Liz, let us know, what do you think about the kind of answers you got there?
Well, I was just wanting to pick up the fact, I think it came out in an earlier question, that we are losing young people from this area. And the gap between incomes in the Lake District and the cost of housing, for example, is so huge that we are literally hemorrhaging the people whom we need to support lots of retired people, people of my age. You know, the services are already groaning, and we know that this is going to be a worsening problem. So really, I was trying to get at the wider gap between income and the cost of actually living in such a beautiful area.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We are at, or I make it on my telephone, 21:41. Have we got time for another question? Have we got the energy for another question? We've got one more we could go to. Yes, we do, don't we? Go on, just one more. We've got another question on our list that we would like to put to our candidates. Elizabeth Robinson has got that question. So, yeah, wait for your mobile mic, and here it comes.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm Libby Robinson. I'm a local. I live in T-Bay. I do have land. I'm very environmentally concerned about what is happening. My question is, how are you going to protect the Cumbrian pastoral hill farming landscape, which is the younger generation's inheritance and affects us all? These are changing times all over the Western world. The UK needs experienced farmers. How can we leave a legacy for our farmers' futures, farming community and culture in Cumbria, which was insisted on being part of our World Heritage Site status?
Tim Farron, you begin answering
and
this final
that
question.
is a brilliant question, and you end where I will start. World Heritage Site status. Now, many of you will remember the debates about whether we should or shouldn't have it. I was in favour of it. Some people are a bit ambivalent about it. But we got granted it a few years ago. And I think the worst thing in the world would be for us to lose it. What would that mean about, what would it say about the kind of community we are and kind of stewards we are for our environment? What would it say and do to our tourism economy? And Liverpool, remember, lost World Heritage Site status a couple of years ago, which is a reminder that it is possible. If you look at UNESCO's document, which set out the granting of World Heritage Site status just a little, was it 6-7 years ago, it gave us much, you have to check it out to see if what I've said is true, but it gave as much kudos and credit to our upland farmers as it gave to the glaciers when it came to the formation of our landscapes. And we could, in the space of a few years, by accident, probably more than by design, because of all the things we said earlier on about how Elms is potentially being botched, undo that and put our World Heritage Site status at risk. Upland farmers are massively precious to us. Yes, in producing food, but in stewarding our most important cultural asset. They are the hands that will make sure that this landscape around us will survive for generations to come and people will want to come and visit the Lake District. And if we let them go out of business, for all the reasons we were saying earlier on, the number of people I see staring down the end of the tunnel and thinking, this is the end for me. I'm in a situation where I've lost 40-odd% of my income in the last 4 or 5 years. What's the future for me? I'll leave the industry. Young people not following their parents, people who are at the end of their career, shall we say, not knowing which way to turn, how can I retire, what kind of succession will there be? And there is an answer to that, and that is within Elms to specifically value heritage, uplands, upland livestock, and upland practices to protect that landscape. And it is possible. Let me say something else nice about a Labour minister. The last time, Keir Starmer may have had his holidays in Little Langdale, the last Labour farming minister was Lord Rooker, Jeff Rooker, who was a militant firebrand in the 70s in the Commons, but when he was in the House of Lords, he was actually a very good farming minister. And he had a timeshare in Elterwater. And he was here often. And what we managed to get him to do was bring in something called the Upland Entry-Level Scheme, which was not perfect, but it was a way of funneling some money into the uplands to make sure that hill farmers were still able to practice, to have the herdwicks, to have the fell ponies, to have the livestock they need to make sure the environment looks as it should do, to farm responsibly, and to have a future be part of what makes this place so very special. So it's not hard and it's not expensive to do it right, and so far this government has woefully failed you, and I am so sorry.
Okay, Pippa.
This is the heritage element of the national park, right? These are the heritages and the cultures that are worth protecting, and that's part of what the national park and kind of surrounding entities should be set up to protect. I've talked already about land use frameworks and how we make sure that nature and climate change and our need to actually farm food work all together. I think one point that I'd like to just make a little bit, put more emphasis on, is that we shouldn't be importing so much of our food, and we're importing too much at the moment. And in a Labour manifesto, we have put in that public sector organisations like air bases, schools, prisons should be buying 50% of their food from UK farms. So what we'll do is put in place that kind of demand mechanism that will support farming in this country. So that's the kind of investment that we want to make into supporting these kind of cultures and ensuring that that heritage isn't lost, and we balance that need to grow food at the same time as protecting nature and climate.
Phil.
I think farmers get a bad rep in this country. There's a sort of a working assumption that they're all just out for the subsidies and they're just money-grabbing businessmen. It's not true. Most of the farmers I've met care passionately about what they do. They care passionately about the food they produce, and they think it's important. They think they're doing an important job and they want to continue it. And they also take a pride in what they do in terms of the actual product. A neighbour of mine was a gruff, tough, miserable of a farmer, but every year he used to put his cattle into the local show, and every year for 5 years he got the best price, and he was the happiest man in the world. That was what mattered to him. And he also cared very much about handing on his farm, in this case not to his children, didn't have any, but he was going to hand it on to somebody else in his family who also shared those values. And I think that all of that is really important. All of that deserves support, but it goes back to something we talked about earlier when we were talking about biodiversity, regenerative farming, all of that. There does need to be change in how often farms are managed. There does need to be an acceptance that just maximising the number of sheep, for example, isn't a great idea. And to be fair, I don't think most farmers ever thought it was, but that's what they were told to do, so they did it. So let's use ELMS, let's use the other mechanisms to reward farmers for doing the things that we all want them to do, including producing food. Thank you.
Okay. Just to chuck a quick iron in the fire here. I mean, some people that haven't voiced an opinion here tonight might well say, well, some of these farms are just too small. They're not making a living. They shouldn't be supported by the public purse. Look at projects like, for example, Wild Horse Water, where they've taken on 2 of the hill farms there. They've brought more people into the area. They've created more employment. They're farming those farms, some people would say, in a much more nature-friendly way by taking sheep off the hills. Is there room for both? We're all agreeing so much here. I feel I need to put another voice into the equation.
I don't think those two things are in opposition at all. I mean, I think the experience in Wild Horse Water was the opposite. Essentially, as you have said, so changes to farming practice that were originally opposed by a number of local people, eventually they came around to it. Eventually they said, well, actually, this is not so bad. You're not trying to get rid of farmers. You're not trying to get rid of the sheep. Yes, you're doing things in a different way, but we can see some of the advantages in terms of more wildlife, more flowers, and. So I don't think it's a choice of one or the other. I think you can genuinely have both.
I mean, some farmers are very worried that their tenancies are at risk because projects that like that but perhaps want them to change the way that they farm.
Yeah, I mean, that is the case. So there are some things in the environmental land management scheme that are positive in principle, but in practice, you're seeing very large landowners using their power in this moment of flux and change to exploit and expel their tenants. It's kind of like a Lakeland clearances in some parts, and it's absolutely outrageous. And so we need to make sure, so there's a Conservative peer called Baroness Rock who chaired the tenant farming inquiry, and her recommendations were all excellent. And I hope the subsequent government will take on board all of her recommendations, including a tenant farmers commissioner. The other thing is simply this: we're not asking to subsidise farmers to just stay there and do nothing. We're asking for farmers to be paid a fair price for the value they provide for us. So if you support farmers properly, then Kendal doesn't flood because you're able to do natural land management, but you've got to, at the same time, incentivise those farmers to carry on doing it because their major motivation is to be a food producer and to be animal stewards. And if you don't work with people's motivation, you don't get any progress whatsoever. And so let's make sure we pay farmers for providing public goods. So what, $3.5 billion a year, the tourism economy for the Lake District? And a pittance, a tiny, tiny fraction of that goes back into the pockets of the farmers who look after the landscape, who make that possible. That's not giving them a subsidy for nothing, it's paying them for the work they have done.
Libby Robinson, what do you make of those answers? Are you heartened?
I think I've spoken to Tim Farron about these things previously over the last year, and it is a time of flux. We have to be so careful about what we're looking after and keeping it in a good heart and having the right kind of drive. 2 things worry me. Local community with young farmers is that there is this threat of inheritance tax being put on agricultural land. Now, any young farmer who wants to take over from his parent or her parents and has been farming in the same farm for generations, they are not going to afford to be able to pay inheritance tax and take on the farm. This needs to be really well thought out, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and kill farming and the experienced farmer because of this. The other thing is, and it's something that I do worry about, is solar panels on agricultural land. We have to be so careful what we're doing here. There have been reports from Spain and Portugal that have had tests on solar panels on the ground. Doesn't matter what height you put these solar panels on agricultural land, and there are people saying you can put chickens and sheep underneath solar panels to graze. The solar panels kill the ground. Within a period of time, they will go back to a desert. The birds won't go anywhere near, wildlife will not go anywhere near. We have to be very, very careful in what we're doing. Solar panels on buildings. I've travelled the country a bit, been down to Nottingham. There are so many of these flat-roofed, huge industrial units that are being built to house different companies. They could all have solar panels on their roof. Think about it. At King's Lynn, the Amazon warehouse that distributes everything around the country, it covers 10 acres.
Libby, thank you for your contribution this evening. Okay, thank you everybody for bearing with us on, it's going to be the hottest evening of the year so far. I think we've all done miraculously staying here. I'd like to thank our candidates very much indeed for what I think was covering a huge number of subjects. So hats off to you guys. And as I say, thank you to you for coming. I'm going to hand you back to Mike, who is going to officially wind the evening up.
I'm not going to keep you long because it is hotter than the surface of the sun. I also want to say thank you to the candidates for braving the stage. It's very hot up there. Quick round of applause, please. Thank you also to Kaz for chairing the whole thing so brilliantly. And to Kate for organising it, and the whole team from Friends of the Lake District who've helped out tonight as well. Now, landscape matters. I said that at the start. And if the kind of topics we've discussed here tonight float your boat, then please consider joining Friends of the Lake District as a member or working with us as a volunteer. Come and see one of the team afterwards and we'll sort you out with some information. And finally, please give yourselves a huge round of applause for turning out, asking questions and supporting us in our drive to get these critical landscape issues up the agenda. Thank you very much.